Well, I reckon every dog has his day, but mine started with a secret that could break a good man's heart. Name's Max, and I'm fixin' to tell you a story that'll test everything you think you know about forgiveness. It was a crisp October evening here in Cedar Falls, Iowa, when I first laid eyes on the man who'd change my life forever. Dr. Robert Mackenzie, Bob to his friends, stood there in his flannel shirt and work boots, staring down at me like he'd seen a ghost. Course, he had good reason to look spooked. You see, I was blocking his front door something fierce. My busted-up body sprawled across his welcome mat like yesterday's newspaper. Been 3 weeks since I'd had a proper meal. 3 weeks since I could walk without that sharp pain shooting up my hind leg like lightning through a storm cloud. But here's the thing that'll knock your socks clean off. The man who saved my life, who nursed me back to health with hands gentle as a Sunday prayer, who whispered sweet words when the pain got too much to bear, was the same man who nearly took it all away from me in the first place. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years back, when the autumn leaves were just starting to turn, Bob Mackenzie had himself a different kind of life. He'd tell me about those days when he thought I was sleeping his voice all soft and distant like he was talking to ghosts. Margaret used to say, "Bob, love isn't about the good times. It's about who stays when the going gets tough," he'd whisper, stroking my fur with hands that shook just a little. Margaret Rose Mackenzie. Now there was a woman who could light up a room just by walking into it. Least that's how Bob remembered her. She'd been his anchor for 37 years, through vet school, through building their practice, through all the small-town gossip and late-night emergencies that come with tending to every critter in 3 counties. But cancer don't care much about love stories. It came for Margaret like a thief in the night, slow and mean and relentless. Bob fought it harder than any enemy he'd ever faced, turning their home into a hospital, their bedroom into a battlefield. Every treatment, every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, he was right there beside her. That's when his boy Tyler started showing his true colors. Now, Tyler Mackenzie was a good man in his own right. Married, got himself a little girl named Emma, worked as an engineer up in Des Moines. But when it came to watching his mama fade away, well, he couldn't stomach Bob's decision to focus on comfort instead of more aggressive treatments. "You're giving up on her, Dad," Tyler had hollered during their last big fight, right there in the hospital corridor where everybody could hear. "She's still fighting, and you're ready to throw in the towel." Bob's response was quieter, but it cut deeper. "Son, sometimes loving someone means knowing when to stop the fight and start the healing." Tyler stormed out that day and never came back. Not for the funeral, not for the reading of the will, not even for a phone call on Bob's birthday. Just gone, like morning mist when the sun gets serious about shining. After Margaret passed, Bob started keeping company with a bottle more than he should have. Bourbon became his breakfast, whiskey his dinner companion. The grief counselor called it complicated bereavement, but Bob had simpler words for it. "Some folks say time heals all wounds, but I reckon some wounds just learn to hide better." The kitchen counter got stacked high with sympathy cards he never opened, casseroles from neighbors he never ate. Tyler's photo got turned face down on the mantel, right next to Margaret's favorite ceramic angel. That house got quiet as a tomb, and Bob Mackenzie started driving roads that led nowhere, drinking away memories that refused to stay buried. That's the man I found myself dependent on, broken, lost, and carrying guilt heavier than a full-grown bull. The night that changed everything started like most of Bob's evenings those days, at Murphy's Tavern, 3 blocks down from the veterinary clinic he'd shuttered after Margaret's funeral. Murphy's was the kind of place where a man could drink his sorrows without anybody asking too many questions, where the bartender knew your poison and your story without needing either spelled out. Joe Murphy had been pouring drinks in Cedar Falls for near on 20 years, and he'd seen his share of broken men. But Bob Mackenzie worried him something fierce. This particular Tuesday night in late September, Bob was nursing his fourth whiskey when Joe finally decided enough was enough. "Bob, you've had enough," Joe said, his voice gentle but firm as he reached for the bottle. "Margaret wouldn't want this for you." Bob's head snapped up like he'd been slapped. His eyes, bloodshot and fierce, locked onto Joe's with a fury that made the whole bar go quiet. "Don't you dare tell me what my wife would want," he growled, slamming his fist on the scarred wooden bar. "You didn't hold her hand when she couldn't keep food down. You didn't watch her waste away to nothing while that poison they called medicine ate her alive from the inside out." The other patrons shifted uncomfortable-like in their seats, suddenly real interested in their beer bottles and the baseball game flickering on the old TV mounted in the corner. Joe kept his voice steady, knowing a wounded animal when he saw one. "I know you're hurting, Bob. We all know it. But this ain't the answer, and you know it too." Bob stood up so fast his bar stool scraped against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. He threw a 20 on the bar, too much for what he'd drunk, but pride makes a man do foolish things. "Keep the change," he muttered, grabbing his keys off the bar. Joe reached out to stop him. "Bob, let me call you a cab. Or hell, I'll drive you home myself." "I'm fine," Bob lied, the words slurring just enough to prove he wasn't. "Been driving these roads since before you were born, Joe Murphy." That was the first mistake. Pride talking when sense should have been listening. The second mistake was climbing behind the wheel of that blue Chevy pickup, the one Margaret used to tease him about keeping longer than most marriages last. The third mistake was turning the key. The rain had started while Bob was inside, not heavy but steady enough to make the roads slick and treacherous. Cedar Falls at night was quiet as a church, most folks already tucked into their beds, preparing for another day of ordinary life. Bob drove slow at first, the headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights looking for answers that weren't there. But the whiskey and the grief were doing their work, and Bob's foot got heavier on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed from 25 to 35 to 45 on roads meant for half that speed. In his mind, he was driving away from the pain, from the empty house that still smelled like Margaret's lavender soap, from the silence that pressed against his eardrums like deep water. That's when I entered the picture, though I didn't know Bob Mackenzie from Adam at the time. I was just a German shepherd trying to find shelter from the rain, crossing Elm Street near the old Methodist church where Margaret used to drag Bob for Sunday services. Been on my own for most of my 3 years, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers who'd toss me a bone or a leftover sandwich. The rain was coming down harder now, and I was looking for a dry spot under the church's covered entrance when I heard the engine. Most times, I was smart enough to stay clear of the road when cars came through. But something about that night made me careless. Maybe it was the hunger gnawing at my belly, or maybe it was just plain bad luck. I was just stepping off the curb when those headlights came barreling toward me like the devil himself was driving. Time did that funny thing it does in moments like these. It stretched out long and thin, like taffy pulling apart. I could see everything with crystal clarity, the raindrops catching the light like tiny diamonds, the way the headlights made my shadow dance crazy-like on the wet pavement, the sound of my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. Then I saw his face behind the windshield. Bob's face, though I wouldn't know his name for weeks yet. His eyes were wide with horror, his mouth opening in what might have been a scream or a prayer. His hands jerked the wheel hard to the right, but physics and whiskey don't negotiate. The truck's front bumper caught me square in the ribs, sending me flying through the air like a rag doll some child had thrown in a fit of temper. The impact drove every bit of air from my lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain shooting through my body. I hit the pavement hard, my left hind leg bending in ways the good Lord never intended. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the sound of squealing brakes and a man's voice, broken and desperate, crying out, "Oh God, what have I done?" When I came to, I don't know how much time had passed. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. The rain was still falling, and I was lying in a puddle that was part rainwater, part something darker I didn't want to think about. Every breath felt like somebody was driving nails into my chest, and when I tried to stand, my left leg just wouldn't hold me. The blue truck was gone. The street was empty except for the rain and the pain and me. I dragged myself to the side of the road, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through my broken body. Found shelter under somebody's porch and waited for death to come calling, figuring that was the end of my story. But I was tougher than I looked, apparently. Tougher and more stubborn than any dog has a right to be. For 3 weeks, I survived on rainwater and the occasional scrap I could scavenge, my body slowly healing wrong in some places, not healing at all in others. The infection set in around day 10, making me feverish and confused, but still I kept breathing, kept hoping for something I couldn't even name. Meanwhile, Bob Mackenzie was living his own kind of hell. He'd driven home that night with his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold the steering wheel. The damage to his truck wasn't much, a cracked headlight, a dented bumper, but it might as well have been a neon sign advertising his guilt. He spent the first week parked outside Murphy's Tavern, not going in, just sitting in his truck staring at the place where his troubles had started. He'd drive by Elm Street sometimes, slow-like, looking for signs of what he'd done, but there wasn't much to see, just a few scrapes on the pavement that could have been from anything. The nightmares started that first week, too. Every time Bob closed his eyes, he'd see those headlights, hear that awful thud, feel that moment when he knew he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd wake up sweating and shaking Margaret's voice echoing in his head. "Bob Mackenzie, you face up to what you've done, you hear me?" But facing up to it and actually doing something about it are two different animals entirely. Bob was scared. Scared of the law. Scared of what Tyler would think if he found out. Scared of admitting to himself that he'd become the kind of man who could hit a dog and drive away. So he drank more, slept less, and waited for the guilt to eat him alive from the inside out. That's how things stood when destiny decided to play its hand, and I found myself dragging my broken body to the front door of the very man who'd put me in that condition. Sometimes the good Lord has a sense of humor darker than midnight. 3 weeks of living on scraps and rainwater will teach a dog things about survival he never wanted to learn. By the time I dragged myself to Bob Mackenzie's front door, I was more ghost than flesh, held together by stubbornness and what some folks might call divine intervention. The infection in my leg had spread something fierce, making me burn with fever 1 minute and shiver like a leaf in a tornado the next. My ribs, where that truck bumper had kissed me so hard, sent shooting pains through my chest every time I breathed. But it wasn't the physical pain that nearly broke me. It was the loneliness, the bone-deep knowledge that I was going to die alone on some street corner, forgotten before I was even gone. That's when something started pulling me toward Maple Street, toward a little white house with green shutters and a front porch that looked like it hadn't seen company in years. Can't rightly explain what drew me there. Maybe it was the smell of antiseptic drifting from the windows, or maybe it was just the desperate hope that whoever lived there might have a soft heart for a dying dog. The house sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, and I could see through the windows that somebody was moving around inside. An older fella, looked to be in his 60s, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Something about that place called to me like a church bell on Sunday morning. They say a dog can smell fear, I thought to myself. But I could smell something else on that autumn wind. Guilt, thick as molasses. My plan was simple, born from the kind of desperation that makes even the smartest dog do foolish things. I positioned myself right in front of that front door, used every last bit of strength I had to wedge my body against it. If whoever lived inside wanted to get out come morning, they'd have to deal with me first. It was my last card to play, and I was betting everything on it. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. I drifted in and out of consciousness, dreaming of warm beds and full food bowls, of hands that petted instead of hurt. Every now and then, I'd hear movement from inside the house, Footsteps on creaky floorboards, the sound of running water, the clink of dishes in a sink. When dawn finally started breaking, I heard those footsteps getting closer to the door. A man's voice, rough with sleep and something that might have been years of unspoken sorrow, muttered, "What in Sam Hill?" The door pushed against me, gentle at first, then with more force. I didn't budge. Couldn't budge, really. My body was done taking orders from my brain. "Come on now," the voice said, strain creeping into it. "What's got you stuck tighter than bark on a tree?" I heard him try the door several more times, each attempt more frustrated than the last. Then came the sound of a window opening and footsteps walking around the side of the house. My heart started hammering against my ribs. This was it, the moment that would decide whether I lived or died. Bob Mackenzie appeared around the corner of his house, and the first thing that struck me was how much older he looked than his years. His hair, once probably brown, had gone mostly gray, and his face carried lines that spoke of sorrows too heavy for one man to bear. He wore that flannel shirt over faded jeans, work boots that had seen plenty of honest labor. When his eyes fell on me, his whole body went rigid, like he'd been struck by lightning. The color drained from his face faster than water from a busted bucket, and his mouth opened and closed without making a sound. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. A broken man and a dying dog, both carrying secrets that could destroy whatever was left of our souls. "I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the morning wind. "It's you." Now I didn't understand what he meant by that. Not yet. All I knew was that this man was looking at me like he'd seen a ghost, and not the friendly kind either. But there was something else in his eyes, something that gave me hope. Recognition mixed with what looked like genuine sorrow. Bob took a step closer, his movements careful and deliberate, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any second. "Easy now, boy," he said, his voice gentler than his expression. "Easy does it." That's when he saw the extent of my injuries, the infected wound on my leg, the way I was favoring my ribs, the fever that had me shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. His face went from shocked to stricken, and I saw his hands tremble as he knelt down beside me. "Oh, sweet Jesus," he breathed. "What happened to you, fella?" Inside Bob's head, a war was raging that I couldn't begin to understand. Yet here was the dog from his nightmares, the one he'd been seeing in his dreams for 3 weeks, lying broken and dying on his front porch. The rational part of his mind was screaming at him to call animal control, to let somebody else deal with this reminder of his worst moment. But another voice was speaking too, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Margaret's. "Bob Mackenzie, you help that creature. You hear me? You help him, and maybe you can start helping yourself." "This can't be happening," Bob muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "This just can't be real." But I was real, and I was dying, and something in his eyes told me he knew it. He reached out slowly, letting me smell his hand before he touched me. His fingers were gentle when they found the matted fur around my neck, checking my pulse, feeling for broken bones. "You're burning up with fever," he said, more to himself than to me. "And this leg? Lord have mercy, this leg is bad infected." I watched his face as he examined me, saw the exact moment when guilt crashed into him like a freight train carrying a full load of regret. His eyes went wide, then squeezed shut tight, and I heard him whisper something that sounded like a prayer and a confession all rolled into one. "I'm sorry," he said, so quiet I almost missed it. "I'm so damned sorry." The decision, when it came, seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. He stood up, his knees crackling like old timber, and looked down at me with something that might have been determination. "Margaret always said you can't undo what's done, but maybe you can do right going forward," he said, talking to me like I could understand every word. Reckon it's time I started listening to my wife again. Bob disappeared into the house and came back with a thick blanket, one that smelled like lavender and old memories. He wrapped me up careful-like, mindful of my injuries, and lifted me with surprising strength for a man his age. I was too weak to struggle, too tired to be afraid, so I just let myself be carried. "Don't you die on me now, boy," he said as he carried me toward his garage. "I've got too much to make up for to lose you now." He'd turned part of his garage into a makeshift veterinary clinic, with an examination table and cabinets full of medical supplies. As he laid me down on that table, I caught sight of something that would have stopped my heart if I'd understood its significance. A blue pickup truck parked in the corner, its front bumper bearing a fresh dent and a crack in the headlight. But I was too far gone to make that connection, too focused on the gentle way this stranger was cleaning my wounds and preparing something that smelled like medicine. All I knew was that for the first time in 3 weeks, somebody was treating me like I mattered, like my life had value. Sometimes the best thing about being a dog, I thought as the pain medication started to take hold, is that we forgive first and ask questions later. Little did I know that this man had more to be forgiven for than I could possibly imagine, and that my arrival at his door wasn't coincidence. It was justice, wearing the disguise of mercy. Recovery is a funny thing. It comes in waves, like the tide, bringing hope one minute and doubt the next. By the end of my first week at Bob's place, I was strong enough to explore beyond the makeshift medical station he'd set up in his garage. My legs still ached something fierce, and my ribs reminded me they were there every time I took a deep breath, but the fever had broken, and my appetite was coming back. Bob had been treating me like I was made of fine china, bringing me warm broth and fresh water, changing my bandages twice a day with hands that were steadier than his voice when he talked to me. He'd settled into a routine of caring for me that seemed to give him purpose, like tending to my wounds was somehow tending to his own. "You're a tough old bird, aren't you?" he'd say while cleaning my infected leg. "Margaret would have liked you. She always said the best souls come in the most broken packages." It was during one of these quiet moments when Bob thought I was napping that curiosity got the better of me. Dogs are naturally nosy creatures, and being cooped up in that garage was starting to make me restless. When Bob went inside to fix himself some coffee, I decided to do a little investigating. The garage was bigger than it looked from my spot on the examination table. Tools hung neat and orderly on pegboards, and shelves lined the walls, filled with everything from motor oil to veterinary supplies that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But it was what sat in the far corner, covered by a blue tarp, that caught my attention. Now, a dog's nose is a powerful thing. We can smell stories that humans can't even imagine, and the smell coming from under that tarp was telling me a story I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. It was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl and my heart race, like recognizing a song you heard in a nightmare. I limped over to that covered shape, my leg protesting every step. The tarp was loose on one side, and it didn't take much effort to nose my way underneath. What I found there hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a blue pickup truck, older but well-maintained, with chrome bumpers that had seen better days. But it wasn't the truck itself that made my blood run cold. It was the damage. The front bumper was dented on the right side, pushed in just enough to tell a story of impact. The headlight on that same side was cracked, spiderwebbed like a broken mirror. Memory hit me like a freight train barreling down a mountain track. That same blue paint, that same dented chrome bumper, that same smell of motor oil and guilt. The pieces started falling together in my mind like dominoes, each one knocking down the next until the whole picture was clear as crystal. The rain-soaked street, the headlights bearing down on me, the horrified face behind the windshield, the sound of impact, the taste of blood, the feeling of flying through the air before everything went dark. This was the truck. This was the truck that had nearly killed me 3 weeks ago, and I was standing in the garage of the man who'd been driving it. My legs went weak, and not from the injuries. I sank down onto the cold concrete floor, my mind racing faster than a greyhound chasing a rabbit. Bob Mackenzie, the man who'd been nursing me back to health, who'd been whispering gentle words when the pain got too bad, who'd been treating me like I was the most precious thing in the world, was the same man who'd hit me and left me for dead on Elm Street. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Here I was, a victim seeking help from my attacker, and he was given it freely, desperately, like his very soul depended on it. Which, I was beginning to understand, it probably did. I heard Bob's footsteps coming back toward the garage, and panic shot through me like electricity. Should I run? Could I even run with my legs still healing? Should I confront him somehow, though I had no way to speak the words that were burning in my throat? Instead, I found myself hiding behind a stack of boxes, watching Bob through a gap in the cardboard. He walked straight to where I'd been lying, saw I was gone, and started calling for me with genuine worry in his voice. Max boy, where'd you get to? He'd taken to calling me Max, said I reminded him of a dog he'd had as a child. Come on, fella, you shouldn't be wandering around yet. But I stayed hidden, watching him search, and that's when I saw something that changed everything. Bob walked over to that covered truck, pulled back the tarp, and just stood there staring at the damage. His shoulders started shaking, and then he did something I never expected. He started talking to it. 3 weeks, he said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 weeks. I've been waiting for you to come knocking on my door. The law, the owner, somebody to make me pay for what I did. He ran his hand along the dented bumper like he was touching a wound that wouldn't heal. I killed you, didn't I? That night on Elm Street. I was drunk, I was angry, and I took it out on the road. And you... His voice broke completely. Sweet Jesus, you came to me for help. I watched from my hiding place as this grown man, this pillar of the community who'd spent his life healing animals, completely fell apart. He sank down next to that truck and started crying, like his heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Margaret, he whispered to the empty air, what kind of man have I become? What kind of monster hits a dog and drives away? He pulled out a photograph from his wallet, a picture of a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, smiling at the camera like she held all the joy in the world. You always said the truth would set me free, but first it'd scare me to death. Well, Maggie, I'm scared to death now. I listened to him pour out his guilt to that photograph, telling his dead wife about the nightmares, the drinking, the way he'd been driving around town looking for signs of what he'd done. He talked about finding me on his doorstep and knowing, somehow knowing, that this was his reckoning come to call. He should hate me, Bob said, his voice barely above a whisper. He should bite me, should run away screaming if dogs could scream, but he looks at me with those eyes, Maggie, those trusting eyes, like he's never been hurt by anything in his whole life. That's when understanding hit me like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Bob Mackenzie wasn't just caring for me out of guilt, though there was plenty of that. He was caring for me because he saw in my broken body a chance at redemption, a way to maybe earn forgiveness for the unforgivable. And me? Well, I had a choice to make. I could run, could find my way back to the streets, and maybe survive long enough for someone else to find me. I could stay and live with the knowledge that my caretaker was also my attacker, knowing that every gentle touch came from hands that had also caused me pain. Or I could do something that would probably seem crazy to anyone who wasn't a dog. I could choose to forgive him. See, that's the thing about dogs that humans never quite understand. We don't hold grudges the way people do. We don't spend our days planning revenge or nursing resentment. We live in the present moment, and in the present moment, Bob Mackenzie was saving my life. Revenge is a luxury us dogs can't afford, I thought to myself, as I watched this broken man weep over his sins. We live in the present, and in the present, this man is saving my life. I limped out from behind those boxes, my decision made. Bob looked up when he heard me comin', his face red and swollen from cryin', and something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. I walked right up to him and laid my head on his knee, just like that. He stared down at me like he couldn't believe what he was seeing, then reached out with trembling fingers to scratch behind my ears. "You know, don't you?" he whispered. "Somehow, you know, and you're staying anyway." And that's exactly what I was doing. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to love anyway. And if that's not the most human thing a dog can do, well, I don't know what is. The second week of my stay at Bob's place settled into a rhythm that felt almost like what normal folks might call a routine. Every morning, Bob would wake before dawn and come check on me, bringing fresh water and whatever he'd cooked up for breakfast, usually scrambled eggs with a bit of bacon, which he'd share without me even having to beg. He'd change my bandages with the careful precision of a man who'd spent his life tending to hurt creatures, all the while keeping up a steady stream of conversation. "You know, Max, can I call you Max? You remind me of a dog I had as a boy," he'd say while cleaning my wounds. "Margaret used to say I needed something to take care of. Said it brought out the best in me, gave me purpose when everything else seemed to be falling apart." Those morning talks became something I looked forward to, even knowing what I knew about him. Bob would tell me stories about his younger days, about building his veterinary practice from nothing, about the animals he'd saved and the few he couldn't. But mostly, he talked about Margaret. 37 years we were married," he'd say, his voice getting soft and distant. "Met her at a church social when I was fresh out of vet school. She was wearing this yellow dress with little white flowers on it, and when she smiled at me, I swear the whole world got brighter." I'd listen to these stories while he worked on my leg, watching his face change as he remembered happier times. The guilt was still there, lurking behind his eyes like a shadow that wouldn't fade, but talking about Margaret seemed to ease something in him, like letting air out of a balloon that was ready to burst. It was during one of these morning sessions that Bob started talking about Tyler, and I could hear the pain in his voice shift from grief to something raw, regret mixed with a father's stubborn pride. "My boy Tyler," Bob said, shaking his head as he applied fresh antiseptic to my healing wound. "Smart as a whip, that one. Got himself an engineering degree, married a good woman, gave me a granddaughter who's prettier than a spring morning. But we had words before Margaret passed, harsh words that I can't seem to take back." He paused in his work, staring off into the distance like he was seeing something I couldn't. "Tyler wanted the doctors to keep fighting, wanted them to try every treatment in the book, even when Margaret was ready to let go, called me a quitter, said I was giving up on her." Bob's hands started trembling slightly as he wrapped fresh gauze around my leg. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did give up too easy. But watching someone you love suffer, Max, there comes a point when keeping them alive starts feeling more like cruelty than kindness. I could hear the weight of that decision in his voice, the way it had been eating at him for 3 years. Here was a man who'd spent his career making life and death decisions about animals, but when it came to his own wife, he second-guessed every choice. "Some bridges burn so bright you can't see the other side through the flames," Bob murmured, finishing up with my bandages. "Tyler took off after the funeral, and I haven't heard from him since. Don't even know if he'd want to hear from me." That afternoon, while Bob was inside fixing lunch, I heard voices from the front porch. Being naturally curious and feeling stronger than I had in weeks, I limped to the garage window to see what was going on. Bob was talking to his neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, Dot, to her friends, a spry woman in her 70s who looked like she could wrestle a bear and come out on top. "Bob Mackenzie, you look better than you have in months," Dot was saying, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "What's got into you?" "You've been eating regular meals and everything." Bob actually smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. Got myself a patient to look after, he said. Keeps me busy, gives me something to focus on besides feeling sorry for myself. Dot nodded approvingly. Margaret always said you were at your best when you had something to take care of. Speaking of which, your boy Tyler called me yesterday. I saw Bob's whole body go rigid at the mention of his son's name. Tyler called you? Don't look so surprised, Dot said with a chuckle. Boy's been calling me every few months since the funeral, asking how you're doing. Too proud to call you directly, but worried sick about his daddy. Bob's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hope, fear, and finally that stubborn pride that seemed to be his biggest enemy. If he's so worried, he knows where to find me. Oh, for heaven's sake, Dot said, throwing her hands up in exasperation. You Mackenzie men are all cut from the same stubborn cloth. He wants to reach out, Bob, has for years. But he doesn't know how to apologize for the things he said, and you're too pig-headed to make the first move. Bob's jaw tightened. I'm not the one who walked away, Dot. No, but you're the daddy, Dot shot back. And sometimes being the parent means swallowing your pride and doing what's best for the family, not what feels good for your ego. After Dot left, Bob came back to the garage looking like he'd been hit by a tornado. He sat down heavily on an old lawn chair he'd dragged in for these visits, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. What do you think, Max? He asked, like I could actually answer. Should I call Tyler? Try to make things right? I wished I could tell him that life's too short for holding grudges, that pride is a cold comfort when you're facing your mistakes alone. Instead, I just walked over and laid my head on his knee, offering what comfort I could. That evening, while Bob was inside making dinner, I noticed him moving around more than usual. I could hear drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, and what sounded like him talking to himself. When he came back to the garage with my evening meal, he was carrying a shoebox under his arm. Found some of Margaret's things, he said, settling into his chair. Haven't looked through them since she passed. He opened the box carefully, like it might contain something that could explode. Inside were letters, photographs, and what looked like a small journal with a faded blue cover. Bob picked up the journal first, running his fingers over the worn leather binding. Margaret kept a diary, he said softly. Wrote in it every day for 40 years. I never read it while she was alive. Seemed like prying. But maybe... He opened to a random page and started reading, his lips moving silently as he took in his wife's words. Suddenly, his face went pale, and his hands started shaking so bad he nearly dropped the journal. Oh, sweet Jesus, he whispered. Margaret, what were you thinking? Bob's eyes were wide as he read, and I could see tears starting to form. Whatever he was reading had hit him like a physical blow. He flipped to another page, then another, reading faster now with growing desperation. She knew, he said, his voice barely audible. She knew about the drinking. She knew I was falling apart, and she was trying to protect me even while she was dying. Bob found a specific entry and read it aloud, his voice breaking. Bob thinks he's hiding his pain from me, but I see it in his eyes every morning. The bottles he thinks I don't notice. The way he comes to bed smelling like Murphy's Tavern. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving him alone with his demons. He flipped to another page, dated just a week before Margaret's death. I asked Dot Patterson to keep an eye on Bob after I'm gone. He's going to blame himself for my death, going to think he gave up too easy. But loving someone means knowing when to fight and when to let go. I pray he understands that someday. Bob closed the journal and sat there in stunned silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. She arranged for Dot to check on me. All this time, I thought Dot was just being neighborly, but Margaret asked her to watch over me. He looked down at me with eyes that held a new kind of pain, The pain of realizing how much love he'd been blind to, how much forgiveness he'd already received without knowing it. She wasn't just fighting cancer, Max, he said. She was fighting to save me too, planning for my future even when she knew she wouldn't be part of it. That night, Bob didn't go inside for his usual evening routine. Instead, he pulled a blanket out of the house and made himself a bed right there in the garage, next to where I was sleeping. As we settled down for the night, he reached over and scratched behind my ears. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'm going to call Tyler. Margaret wouldn't want this family broken forever, and neither do I." For the first time since I'd arrived at his door, Bob Mackenzie fell asleep without the help of a bottle, and I knew we were both starting to heal from wounds deeper than anything you could see with the naked eye. The nightmares started that very night, like Margaret's journal had opened some door in Bob's mind that he'd been keeping locked tight. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of him thrashing in his makeshift bed, muttering words I couldn't quite make out. His breathing was sharp and panicked, like a man drowning in his sleep. "No, no, no," he was saying, his voice thick with terror. "Get out of the road. Please, get out of the road." I limped over to where he lay tangled in his blanket, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. His hands were clenched into fists, and his whole body was rigid with tension. Whatever he was dreaming about had him trapped in a place where apologies couldn't reach. "Margaret!" he cried out suddenly, his voice breaking like a teenager's. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry I let you down." That's when I understood that Bob's nightmares weren't just about me and that rainy night on Elm Street. They were about everything. Margaret's death, Tyler's anger, the slow dissolution of a man who'd once been strong enough to heal others but couldn't figure out how to heal himself. I nudged his shoulder gently with my nose, and his eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize where he was or who I was. Then reality came flooding back, and he sat up so fast it made him dizzy. "Jesus Christ," he gasped, running his hands through his sweat-soaked hair. "I'm losing my mind, Max. I'm completely losing what's left of my mind." But the nightmares were just the beginning. Over the next few days, Bob started exhibiting behavior that worried me more than his drinking ever had. He'd stand in front of that blue truck for hours, just staring at the damage, having conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he'd argue with Tyler, defending decisions he'd made 3 years ago. Other times he'd plead with Margaret, begging her forgiveness for things that seemed to go beyond her death. "I should have made you fight harder," he'd tell her photograph. "Should have insisted on the aggressive treatment. Tyler was right. I gave up on you too easy." Then, in the same breath, he'd switch to defending his choice. "But you were in so much pain, Maggie. You begged me to let you go peaceful. What kind of husband would I be if I ignored that?" It was like watching a man put himself on trial every single day, serving as prosecutor, defender, and judge all at once. And the verdict was always the same: guilty on all counts. The worst part was when he started talking to me like I was some kind of divine messenger, sent to deliver judgment on his sins. "You came to me for a reason, didn't you, Max?" he'd say, his eyes having that fevered look of a man who'd been staring into the abyss too long. 3 weeks you suffered because of what I did, and then you dragged yourself to my door. That's not coincidence. That's providence." I tried to show him through my actions that I'd forgiven him, that I didn't see him as a monster. I'd bring him his slippers in the morning, sit by his side when he was reading Margaret's journal, even rest my head on his lap when the guilt got so heavy it bent his shoulders. But nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of self-loathing he'd built around himself. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after I'd discovered the truth about the truck. Bob had been drinking again. Not much, but enough to loosen the chains he'd been keeping on his demons. He was sitting on the garage floor next to that damned blue pickup, holding Margaret's photograph in one hand and a half-empty bottle of bourbon in the other. "I killed you, didn't I?" he said to me, his words slurring slightly. that night on Elm Street. I was drunk. I was angry at the whole world, and I took it out on you. And God help me, you came to me for help." He took another drink, his hand shaking so bad he nearly dropped the bottle. "Margaret always said the truth would set you free, but first it'd scare you to death. Well, Maggie, I'm scared to death now." Bob stood up unsteadily and walked over to a workbench where he kept his veterinary supplies. To my horror, he pulled out a syringe and a small vial of something that made my blood run cold. Pentobarbital, the same drug used to put animals to sleep permanently. "Maybe the world would be better off without Bob Mackenzie," he muttered, filling the syringe with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Can't hurt any more dogs, can't disappoint any more sons, can't let down any more wives." The sight of that needle filled with death sent panic shooting through me like electricity. This man, this broken, guilt-ridden man who'd been caring for me with such tenderness, was about to do something that couldn't be undone, and I was the only one there to stop him. I barked once, sharp and loud, but Bob barely glanced in my direction. He was beyond hearing now, lost in a place where despair had drowned out everything else. He held the syringe up to the garage light, checking for air bubbles with the professional competence of someone who'd done this procedure hundreds of times on animals beyond saving. "I'm sorry, Max," he said, his voice eerily calm now. "I'm sorry I hit you, sorry I left you for dead, sorry I couldn't be the man Margaret thought she married. Maybe in the next life, I'll do better." That's when I did something I'd never done before in my life. I threw my entire body between Bob and that syringe. My leg protested with sharp bolts of pain, but I didn't care. I knocked into him hard enough to send him stumbling backward, the syringe flying out of his hand to shatter against the concrete floor. Bob stared at me in shock, then at the broken glass and spilled medication that represented his final solution. For a moment, I thought he might be angry, might push me away and reach for another dose. Instead, he collapsed onto the floor like a marionette whose strings had been cut. "Why?" he asked, looking at me with eyes that held more pain than any creature should have to bear. "Why won't you let me go? After what I did to you, why do you care if I live or die?" I walked over to him and did the only thing I could do. I pressed my body against his side and stayed there, offering what comfort a dog can give to a human whose soul is bleeding out on a garage floor. Bob wrapped his arms around me and held on like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. "I don't understand," he whispered into my fur. "I don't understand how you can forgive me when I can't forgive myself." We stayed like that for hours, a broken man and the dog he'd broken, finding some kind of peace in the simple act of not being alone. As dawn started creeping through the garage windows, Bob finally spoke again, his voice hoarse from crying. "Margaret used to say that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to love anyway," he said. I never understood what she meant until right now. He pulled back to look at me, really look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. "You're trying to teach me something, aren't you, boy?" he said. "Something about second chances and redemption and all those things Margaret used to preach about in Sunday school." I didn't know if I was teaching him anything, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this man destroy himself over a mistake he'd already paid for in ways that mattered. Bob Mackenzie wasn't a monster. He was just a human being who'd stumbled in the dark and couldn't find his way back to the light. "Okay," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Okay, Max. If you're willing to give me another chance, maybe I can try to give myself one too." He cleaned up the broken glass and the spilled medication, moving with purpose for the first time since I'd known him. Then he went to the workbench and pulled out his cell phone, an old flip phone that looked like it hadn't been used in months. "Tyler," he said to himself, staring at the phone like it was a live snake. "Time to call Tyler. But first," He knelt down beside me and scratched behind my ears with those gentle hands that had saved my life and nearly ended his own. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing me that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're not sure you deserve them." As Bob dialed his son's number, I settled down next to him, ready to offer whatever support I could for the conversation that would either begin healing this fractured family or break Bob's heart all over again. Either way, he wouldn't face it alone. Bob stared at that old flip phone for the better part of an hour, opening and closing it like he was practicing for the most important conversation of his life, which, I suppose, he was. His hands were shaking again, but not from withdrawal this time. This was the kind of trembling that comes from standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you have to jump but not sure if there's solid ground waiting on the other side. "What if he hangs up on me?" Bob asked, looking down at me like I might have an answer. "What if he's moved on, doesn't want anything to do with his old man anymore?" I could only offer what I'd been offering all along, my presence, steady and unwavering. But sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone gives you the courage to take that first step into the unknown. Bob finally dialed the number, his fingers moving slowly across the worn keypad like each digit was a mountain he had to climb. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and I could see him starting to lose his nerve. "Hello?" The voice that came through the tiny speaker was deeper than I'd expected, with an edge of wariness that spoke of old wounds still tender to the touch. "Tyler?" Bob's voice cracked like he was 13 again. "Tyler, it's your dad." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear the sound of breathing on the other end of the line, but no words came. Bob's face went pale, and I could see him preparing to apologize and hang up. "Dad?" Tyler's voice was softer now, filled with something that might have been surprise or relief, or maybe just exhaustion. "Jesus, Dad, How are you?" Bob started, then stopped, looking around the garage at the evidence of his breakdown. The empty bottles, the medical supplies, the blue truck that had started all this. "I'm not good, son. Haven't been good for a long time. Dot Patterson called me last week," Tyler said. "She said you seemed different, better somehow. Said you had a dog now." Bob looked down at me and managed something that might have been a smile. "His name's Max. He's been keeping me honest." "Dad, I've been wanting to call," Tyler said, and I could hear the weight of 3 years' worth of unsaid words in his voice. "Ever since Mom's funeral, I've been picking up the phone and putting it down. I said some terrible things to you, and No," Bob interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "No, son, you were right. About everything. I did give up on your mother too easy, and I've been giving up on everything else ever since." There was another pause, and when Tyler spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "She asked me to take care of you, you know, right before she died, when you were getting coffee. She made me promise to look after you, and instead I abandoned you when you needed me most." Bob's face crumpled, and I watched 3 years of stubborn pride and accumulated grief finally start to crack. "I needed you so bad, Tyler. After the funeral, after you left, I fell apart." "I know," Tyler whispered. "Dot's been keeping me informed. The drinking, the isolation. Dad, I should have come home. Should have swallowed my pride and—" "We both should have done a lot of things differently," Bob said. "But maybe it's not too late to start doing things right." That's when I heard another voice in the background, higher, younger, excited. "Is that Grandpa Bob? Is that really Grandpa Bob on the phone?" Tyler's voice moved away from the phone briefly. "Yes, sweetheart, it's Grandpa." Then closer again. "Dad, Emma wants to talk to you." "She's been asking about you for months." Before Bob could respond,
A child's voice came bubbling through the phone like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Grandpa Bob, Daddy said you have a doggy now. What's his name? Is he big? Can I meet him?" Bob's face transformed completely, years seeming to fall away as his granddaughter's enthusiasm washed over him. "His name is Max, sweetheart, and he's a German Shepherd. He's very big and very gentle, and I think he'd love to meet you." "Daddy, can we go see Grandpa Bob and Max, please? Pretty please with sugar on top?" Tyler came back on the line, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "What do you say, Dad? Think you're up for some visitors? Emma's been driving me crazy asking about her grandfather, and honestly, I miss you. I miss us being a family." Bob looked around the garage again, but this time I could see him calculating not the extent of his failure, but what needed to be done to make this place suitable for a 6-year-old girl. "How soon can you get here?" "We could leave after Emma gets out of school tomorrow," Tyler said. "Be there by evening, if that's okay." "More than okay," Bob said, his voice breaking with relief. "Tyler, there are things I need to tell you. Things I've done that you need to know about. Dad, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. That's what families do." After they hung up, Bob sat in stunned silence for several minutes, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Then he sprang into action with more energy than I'd seen from him since I'd arrived. "Max, we've got work to do," he said, already moving toward the house. "If Emma's coming to visit, this place needs to be fit for a little girl." The next 18 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Bob cleaned the house from top to bottom, putting away the bottles, washing dishes that had been sitting in the sink for weeks, making up the guest room that had been serving as a storage area. He even went to the grocery store, his first public appearance in months, and came back with ingredients for Emma's favorite cookies, which he'd somehow remembered after 3 years. But the hardest part was dealing with the blue truck. Bob stood in front of it for a long time that afternoon, keys in his hand, trying to decide what to do. "I can't have her see this," he said to me. "Can't have Tyler see it either, not until I explain everything." He started the engine and drove it to the far end of his property, parking it behind the old barn where it couldn't be seen from the house. When he came back, he was carrying something I hadn't expected, a small suitcase and what looked like official papers. "I'm going to turn myself in, Max," he said, settling into his lawn chair. "After Tyler and Emma go home, I'm going to call the police and tell them what I did. It's time to face the music." That evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Bob straightened his shirt one more time and looked down at me nervously. "How do I look, boy? Think they'll be able to forgive a foolish old man?" Before I could offer any kind of response, the front door burst open and a small tornado in the form of Emma Mackenzie came racing into the house. "Grandpa Bob! Grandpa Bob!" she squealed, launching herself into Bob's arms with the fearless abandon that only children possess. "I missed you so much." "Daddy said you were sad, but you don't look sad now." Bob caught her and held on tight, tears streaming down his face as he buried his nose in her blonde hair. "I'm not sad anymore, sweetheart. Not anymore." Tyler appeared in the doorway, taller and more serious than I'd imagined, but with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle mouth. He looked older than his 35 years, like the last 3 years had aged him too. "Hello, Dad," he said simply. Bob set Emma down and walked over to his son, and for a moment they just stood there, 2 grown men trying to figure out how to bridge a gap that had seemed insurmountable just 24 hours earlier. Then Tyler stepped forward and wrapped his father in a hug that spoke of forgiveness and second chances, and the kind of love that survives even the worst mistakes. "Welcome home, son," Bob whispered. Emma, meanwhile, had discovered me and was already trying to convince me to play fetch with a tennis ball she'd produced from her backpack. "Max," she said, like we were old friends. "Grandpa Bob, he's even more beautiful than you said." As I watched this family begin to heal, I realized that sometimes the best gifts aren't the ones you bring to someone's door. They're the ones that come walking through it, ready to love you despite everything you've done wrong. The reckoning could wait another day. Tonight was for miracles.
6 months later, I was lying in my favorite spot on the front porch, watching Bob teach Emma how to properly hold a stethoscope. The morning sun was warming my fur, and the sound of their laughter was better than any medicine I'd ever received. It's funny how life can change so completely that you start to forget what the pain felt like, though I reckon that's more blessing than curse. Bob had kept his word about turning himself in. 3 days after Tyler and Emma went back to Des Moines, he'd walked into the Cedar Falls police station with me by his side, ready to confess to the hit and run that had nearly cost me my life. Chief Williams, a man who'd known Bob since they were boys, listened to the whole story with the kind of patience that comes from years of hearing people's worst moments. "Bob," Chief Williams had said after hearing every detail, "you know I have to file charges. Can't just pretend this didn't happen." "I know, Jim," Bob replied, his voice steady for the first time in months. "I'm ready to face whatever consequences come my way." The legal proceedings took 4 months to resolve. Bob's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Hendricks, who Tyler had hired, argued for community service instead of jail time, pointing to Bob's spotless record, his voluntary confession, and the fact that he'd been caring for me ever since the accident. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harold Carmichael, seemed more interested in Bob's transformation than in punishment. "Mr. Mackenzie," Judge Carmichael had said during sentencing, "this court recognizes that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making things right. You'll serve 200 hours of community service at the Cedar Falls Animal Shelter, and you'll surrender your driver's license for 6 months." Bob had accepted the sentence with something approaching relief. The community service, it turned out, was exactly what he needed. Working with abandoned and abused animals gave him a purpose that went beyond his own guilt, and I'd often accompany him to the shelter, serving as a kind of therapy dog for the newer arrivals who were still learning to trust humans again. "You know what's funny, Max?" Bob said one afternoon as we were helping a scared pit bull named Rosie learn to play again. "I spent 40 years as a veterinarian thinking I was in the business of fixing animals. Turns out, they were fixing me right back." Tyler had moved back to Cedar Falls in February, taking a job with a Des Moines engineering firm that let him work remotely 3 days a week. He and Emma rented a small house just 6 blocks from Bob's place, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to give everyone space to adjust to being a family again. The conversations between father and son weren't always easy. 3 years of silence had left wounds that needed tending, and both men had to learn how to trust each other again. But Emma, with the magical ability children have to see past adult complications, served as a bridge between them. "Grandpa Bob," she'd say when tensions ran high during family dinners, "will you tell me again about the time you helped that horse with the broken leg?" And Bob would launch into one of his stories, his voice taking on that gentle cadence that had first drawn me to trust him, and gradually, Tyler would find himself leaning in, remembering the father he'd admired before grief and pride had gotten in the way. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday in March. Emma had been at Bob's house after school, and I was watching her help him organize his medical supplies when she suddenly asked the question that had been hanging in the air for months. "Grandpa Bob, why were you and Daddy so mad at each other?" Bob looked over at Tyler, who'd arrived to pick Emma up, and I saw something pass between them, a recognition that honesty, even difficult honesty, was the only way forward. "Well, sweetheart," Bob said, settling into his chair with Emma on his lap, "when your Grandma Margaret was very sick, your daddy and I disagreed about how to help her. We both loved her very much, but we had different ideas about what was best." Emma considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "But you both wanted to help her, right?" "Yes," Tyler said,
his voice thick with emotion. We both wanted to help her. Then you were both doing good things, Emma concluded with 6-year-old logic. Sometimes grown-ups do good things in different ways, and that's okay. Tyler and Bob stared at each other across the room, and I watched years of accumulated anger and hurt begin to dissolve in the face of a child's simple wisdom. She's right, you know, Tyler said quietly. We were both trying to do good things. Bob nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. Your mother would be so proud of you, son. Both of you. She always said love finds a way. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Tyler stayed to help Bob with some repairs around the house. As they worked together, I listened to them talk about Margaret, really talk about her for the first time since her death. They shared memories I'd never heard before, stories about her terrible cooking and her beautiful singing voice, about the way she'd insisted on rescuing every stray animal in 3 counties. She knew, didn't she? Tyler said as they fixed a loose board on the front steps. About the drinking, about how bad you were struggling. Bob paused in his hammering. She knew everything, even arranged for Dot to keep an eye on me after she was gone. Your mother was planning for my future even when she knew she wouldn't be part of it. That sounds like Mom, Tyler said with a sad smile. Always 3 steps ahead, always taking care of everyone else. Just like you, Bob said, looking at his son with pride. Moving back here, making sure Emma gets to know her grandfather. Taking care of family even when that family hasn't deserved it. The conversation that followed was long overdue. Apologies offered and accepted. Explanations given and received. And finally, the kind of forgiveness that heals, rather than just bandages over wounds. Spring brought new traditions to our expanding family. Sunday dinners at Bob's house became a weekly event, with Tyler bringing his famous barbecue and Emma insisting on setting the table with Margaret's good china. Bob reopened his practice on a limited basis, focusing on house calls for elderly pets whose owners couldn't get to a regular vet. But the biggest change came in May, when Tyler made an announcement that surprised everyone. Emma and I have been talking, he said during one of our Sunday dinners, and we think it's time for some changes around here. Emma bounced in her chair with excitement. Tell him, Daddy. Tell Grandpa Bob. Tyler grinned at his daughter's enthusiasm. We want to move in with you, Dad, if you'll have us. This house is too big for 1 person and 1 dog, and Emma's convinced that Max needs a little girl to take care of. Bob's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, concern, and finally, pure happiness. Are you sure, son? It's a big step, all of us under one roof again. I'm sure, Tyler said. We're family, Dad. It's time we started acting like it. Emma jumped up from her chair and threw her arms around Bob's neck. Please say yes, Grandpa Bob. I promise I'll be good, and I'll help take care of Max, and I'll even eat vegetables without complaining. Bob laughed, the sound rich and full of life. Well, if you're willing to eat vegetables, how can I say no? The moving process took most of the summer, but by August, Tyler and Emma were settled into their new home. Emma had claimed the bedroom that used to be Tyler's, complete with the baseball posters he'd put up 30 years ago. Tyler took the guest room, and I found myself with more attention than any dog deserves. 3 humans to spoil me, and a little girl who was convinced I was the smartest dog in the world. Max understands everything I say, Emma would tell anyone who'd listen. He's not just a dog, he's my best friend. She wasn't wrong. I did understand more than most people realized, including the night Tyler found Bob sitting in the garage, staring at the space where the blue truck used to be. You miss it, don't you? Tyler asked, settling into the old lawn chair beside his father. Miss what? The guilt, Tyler said simply. It's been your companion for so long, you don't know who you are without it. Bob was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes I wake up feeling good, feeling happy, and then I remember what I did. Feels wrong somehow. being happy when I caused so much pain. Tyler looked over at me, sleeping peacefully in my bed. But look at him, Dad. Look at Max. He's not in pain anymore. He's not angry or scared or hurt. He's just happy. Don't you think he'd want you to be happy too? Your mother used to say something like that, Bob murmured. Said holding on to guilt was like trying to drive a car while staring in the rearview mirror. You can't see where you're going if you're always looking at where you've been. Smart woman, our Margaret, Tyler said. The smartest, Bob agreed. That fall, Emma started first grade at Cedar Falls Elementary, the same school Tyler had attended 30 years earlier. Bob would walk her to school every morning, with me trotting alongside, and pick her up every afternoon. The routine gave structure to our days and purpose to Bob's recovery. One October afternoon, almost exactly a year after I'd first knocked on Bob's door, Emma came running out of school with a piece of paper clutched in her small fist. "Grandpa Bob! Max!" she called out, her voice filled with excitement. "Look what I wrote!" She handed Bob a story she'd written for her class assignment about heroes. The title, written in careful 6-year-old handwriting, was My Grandpa and His Dog Max. Bob read the story aloud as we walked home. My grandpa was very sad because my grandma went to heaven. Then Max came to live with us and made Grandpa happy again. Max is a hero dog because he saves people who are sad. The end. Bob's voice cracked on the last words, and he had to stop walking for a moment to compose himself. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to hug Emma. "But you know what? I think Max and I saved each other." Emma considered this with her usual seriousness. "Like how Daddy says teamwork makes everything better?" "Exactly like that," Bob said. As we walked home through the falling leaves, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us all together. I'd come to Bob's door looking for someone to save my life, but I'd found something much more valuable. I'd found a family that needed saving as much as I did. They say every dog has his day, I thought as Emma skipped beside me, her hand resting on my head. But I got a lifetime, and that seemed like more than enough. 2 years have passed since that October day when Emma wrote her story about heroes, and I'm sitting here in the morning sunshine, watching the newest addition to our family take his first wobbly steps across the kitchen floor. Little Bobby Mackenzie, named after his grandfather, much to Bob's tearful delight, just turned 1 last month, and Tyler's wife Sarah has been the missing piece this family didn't even know it needed. Sarah came into our lives 18 months ago, a widow herself who understood the particular kind of loneliness that settles into your bones after losing the love of your life. She and Tyler met at the Cedar Falls Community Center during a grief support group that Bob had finally convinced Tyler to attend. Sometimes healing happens when broken people help other broken people, Bob had said, and as usual, he was right. The wedding was small and beautiful, held right here in Bob's backyard with Emma as the flower girl and me as the unofficial ring bearer. Margaret would have loved Sarah's gentle way with Emma, her patience with Bob's stories about the old days, and most of all, the way she made Tyler laugh again. Really laugh, not just the polite chuckles he'd been managing since Margaret's death. Folks always ask me, I think to myself as I watch this beautiful chaos of family life unfold around me, if I could talk to humans, what would I say? Well, I reckon I'd tell them this. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to try again when you mess up. It's about showing up at someone's door when you're broken and trusting they'll help you heal. And sometimes, just sometimes, you'll find that in saving someone else, you save yourself too. Bob still volunteers at the animal shelter 3 days a week, and I go with him, helping scared animals learn to trust again. Emma, now 8, has declared she wants to be a veterinarian just like Grandpa Bob. Tyler has started his own engineering consulting firm, and Sarah teaches piano lessons in what used to be Margaret's sewing room. So that's my story. Started with a lie,
grew through forgiveness, and ended with truth. Margaret was right all along. Love really is like a candle lighting another candle. The more you share it, the brighter the whole world gets. And if that ain't worth a dog's devotion, well, I don't know what is. If you're reading Max's story and feeling that familiar ache in your chest, you're not alone. Maybe you've lost the love of your life, watched your children drift away, or carry guilt about choices you made when grief clouded your judgment. Max's journey with Bob Mackenzie isn't just a story about a dog and his owner. It's about second chances, forgiveness, and the healing power of love that comes when we least expect it. At 55, 60, or 68, you might think your best days are behind you, but Bob discovered something profound. Sometimes our greatest heartbreak becomes the doorway to our deepest joy. His garage became a place of healing. His broken relationship with Tyler transformed into something stronger, and his guilt became the foundation for purpose. The family dinners, Emma's laughter, baby Bobby's first steps, none of it would have happened without that dark night when everything fell apart. Your story isn't over. Your capacity to love, be loved, and make a difference hasn't expired with your AARP card. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we're brave enough to knock on someone's door and ask for help. Engagement questions. What's one relationship in your life that you wish you could heal? And what's the first small step you could take toward forgiveness? Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing in disguise that seemed like a crisis at first, but led to something better? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.